Marty, to him join us today. Of course, there's a long-time PR man for the New York Yankees. Continues to work in public relations, but really a Yankee historian. His book is called Pinstripe Empire, New York Yankees from before the Babe to after the Boss. We had him on a couple of years ago when his book about Thurman Munson was out. It's great to have Marty join us again tonight. Marty, thanks for joining us tonight.
Oh, it's always a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Well, Marty, as I said to you just before we went on the air, I sort of worked in hand in glove with you being a Yankee historian, and over the weekend playing the great series that they've been running, and there was a lot on Reggie Jackson and a lot on the boss himself, and of course a great deal on Catfish Hunter, and they're a great series to be a part of, and you're a big part of it.
You're referring to the Yankeeographies on the Yankee-owned Yes Network, and it's an honor to be on those. And I guess they've done 70 or 80 of them by now, and it's just great Yankee history. I mean, this franchise has no shortage of interesting personalities, that's for sure.
Oh, you're right there. Doug?
Yeah, just kind of amplifying on that, Don, Marty, you've been with the team going back, I guess, 68 when you first came up with the team doing PR. So you kind of saw the lean years into the great years of the late 70s, and then the great teams like you mentioned with Catfish and Reggie, and of course Billy Martin. We just mentioned him before we went on the air. Kind of joking, what if Billy Martin, we had, the great sports talk radio show we now when Billy Martin was around. You didn't really need it back then, though. I mean, it made the national TV with what was going on with the Bronx Zoo back then.
Absolutely. I mean, it was primitive days in terms of media. There was no social media that was logging everything, no bloggers on the scene in those days, but everybody knew about the stirrings in the Bronx with Billy Martin and George Steinbrenner and Reggie Jackson and Thurman Munson. Those were crazy times.
Marty, it's almost a war and peace. How long did it take you to put this thing together? I mean, you could use this for a stepladder going up to the second tier of the book row.
Yeah, it's you get your money's worth. It's 620 pages. But, when you divide it among 110 seasons and about 1,500 ball players, people have been saying that it reads kind of crisply. It goes fast, and you can pick it up like at any portion and just kind of read about that particular era. It doesn't have to be a front-to-back read. So you're talking to a guy who wrote a lot of Yankee yearbooks, and this is not a Yankee yearbook. This is the truth, the good times and the bad, and it's really a baseball history because the Yankees were such an important part of baseball history.
You go back from day one when the Yankees were the Highlanders back in the early 1900s. How much the history, or where do you find the history of those really early years? Old newspapers, or did the team have an archive, or how did you get that information?
The team doesn't have much of an archive. In fact, it's funny you mentioned that because nobody had asked that before. George Weiss, who was the general manager of the team up until 1960, he wound up when they let him and Casey Stengel go at the same time, and he took all his papers with him. So technically they belonged to the team, but he cleaned out his files and he took them with him. And he never wrote a memoir, and if there was one thing lacking in research, boy, I would have loved to have had a memoir from George Weiss.
Oh, yeah.
But nevertheless, I knew where to dig. I knew how to find the old newspapers that were long defunct and out of business. And I guess, in a way, I'd been researching this all my life without even knowing this project was coming. I remember one spring training in the early 70s, I went to dinner with Roger Peckinpah, who had managed the Yankees in 1914.
Wow.
And he's the oldest player that I had ever met. And I actually taped our conversation with his knowledge and permission. And that was sort of the starting point. When I sat down to begin this project, I was able to talk to the guy who had managed the team in 1914.
Well, the oldest New York Yankee that I knew well wasn't really a Yankee. He was a Washington Senator. Was George Case, and George, of course, later became a coach. And when they were over in Fort Lauderdale, and George was a next-door neighbor of mine, growing up in Lower Bucks County, and he had so much of the history, not only of the league, but of course of the Washington Senators, and as importantly, the New York Yankees. He was always a great guy to talk to about. And the other fellow that I spoke a great deal with, who still, unfortunately, is dead today, but always thought the that the A's were a better team in '29 than the Yankees were, and Jimmy was a real baseball guy, and of course a lot of competition in those days between the Philadelphia Athletics and the New York Yankees.
Absolutely, and he was right. I mean, Philadelphia did beat out the Yankees in those years. You know, Babe Ruth was only on 4 World Championship teams, so that when Derek Jeter and Jorge Posada and Andy Pettitte won a 5th ring, and Mariano Rivera, they won a 5th World Series ring in 2009. That's more than Babe Ruth had.
Amazing, isn't it?
Yeah.
I actually read every page of the book, Marty. I always like to read the book before we have our guests on. And like you said, it's one of those books, you read 10 or 20, 30 pages at a time, pick an era as you're going through. And a lot of the history, of course, you know from growing up in New York, but a lot I didn't know. And you go back to the Babe Ruth years, and that is kind of surprising. You think those Yankee teams from, say, 20 to about 32, they won every year. That's what you would think. They didn't. They competed pretty much every year for the World Series, but they did not win every year.
One of my favorite Babe Ruth stories that I uncovered was he used to keep a head of cabbage in the water cooler in the dugout, which was only for him. Nobody else could touch his head of cabbage. And every inning, he'd peel off a new cabbage leaf and put it under his cap, and that would keep him cool while he was in the outfield.
He was a complicated guy, though, wasn't he? I mean, you talk about it in the book. Obviously, we know the fun-loving side to the Babe, but he had a kind of a dark side, didn't he, or a difficult side?
Well, of course, he had that very difficult upbringing, being raised in an orphanage, being dispatched to an orphanage when his parents were still living. I mean, how incorrigible could he have been at 6 years old? So that's a tough thing to do to a child. But, St. Mary's Industrial School in Baltimore is where he learned baseball, and baseball made him the best-known figure in America this side of the president and Charlie Chaplin. Everybody knew who Babe Ruth was, and he made baseball part of everybody's conversation.
And looking back in your research, was the Gehrig, Lazari, Ruth era as dramatic as the Zoo?
Well, the Bronx Zoo in the 1970s kind of stands alone because of all the internal conflict between the personalities. You didn't really have that during the Murderers Row years. Babe was, he was his own man and a little tough to discipline. It was after he left the team, after the 34 season, that this corporate Yankee style that used to so irritate Yankee haters kicked in. And that was the tone was set by the owner, Jacob Ruppert, and carried forward by the manager, Joe McCarthy, and best exemplified by the way Bill Dickey and Lou Gehrig and Joe DiMaggio carried themselves. So the Yankee way, both on and off the field, came to be seen as kind of arrogant and, maybe uber professional. And boy, did it irritate the people who just hated the Yankees for winning all the time.
I was kind of surprised, Marty, and you give all the statistics of attendance over the years, and those glory years of the Yankees in the 20s and 30s, you'd think they were drawing 30, 40,000 a game. They didn't back then. Obviously, there's no television, probably very little radio, so it's newspapers that pretty much covered the team. But I would have thought there'd been a higher attendance, but there wasn't, right?
Well, you have to remember the 30s was the Great Depression in the
Sure.
United States. The industry didn't grow very much at all. It was asking a lot of people even to pay $1 or less to take in a ball game, including the subway or on top of the subway fare to get up to the Bronx. So just the fact that the game managed to continue on despite the nation's economic woes was an accomplishment. Jacob Ruppert would have loved to have seen the industry grow and kept the Yankees thriving at the head of the pack, but it was just not a good time for it.
How about just a sort of a sidebar Frankie Crosetti was always an intriguing factor to me, not only from playing, but being with the team so long and their third base coach. They used to kid about him. He made more money from being in the pension than he did, coaching the Yankees. But about any little interesting anecdotes about Frank Crosetti?
Well, personal anecdote. I mean, when I joined the team in '68, he was still the third base coach.
Right.
And, of course, he was a legend. He had started in 1932. And the thing I remember about him is what a good company man he was, because one of his responsibilities was the ball bag, the heavy leather bag where they would keep all the batting practice balls. And the deal was that once the gates opened, balls hit into the stands belonged to the fan, whoever caught it, during batting practice. But if the gates didn't open, let's say it was a 2 o'clock game and the gates opened at 12, well, before 12, if the player hit a batting practice ball into the stands and like an early arriving concession worker would retrieve it, Crosetti would leap over the fence and start running after the guy to get the ball back. You never saw such a loyal company man as Frankie Crosetti.
Well, I think he was just as close with his wallet in his pocket as he was with those balls.
Well, he had all those World Series checks in that wallet.
Well, you look back at the Yankees, Marty. I mean, obviously, we said there's no television in those glory years of the 20s and 30s, very little radio, but there were some great movies made about involving the Yankees. I guess the most famous is Pride of the Yankees. There was a Babe Ruth story, not very good with William Bendix, but they made it that way into newsreels. I guess that's where people really got to see the Babe, at least in some highlights, right? I mean, and reading newspaper accounts.
Well, newsreels were very big in those days. People would go to the movies, and they would see, short subjects and documentaries and a double feature, sometimes live entertainment, and always newsreels, usually by Fox Movie Tone News. And that's where, over and over again, you'd see the important moments in baseball that we still tend to see today on documentaries, like Lou Gehrig's speech. Today I consider myself the luckiest man on the face of the earth, that speech.
Right.
And that's where people would see those things. Pride of the Yankees, the Lou Gehrig movie with Gary Cooper, was still, a lot of people today think it's the best baseball movie ever made. It's a wonderful love story, and it just made a lot of people into Lou Gehrig and New York Yankee fans.
Was and in your research, maybe you found this to be fact or fiction, that Gehrig, when he actually made that speech, did not know that this was a disease that was going to take his life, that he still thought there was a chance at that particular time to move past having Lou Gehrig's disease. Was that true or untrue?
That was true. He did not know. He was a prolific letter writer, writing to the doctors at the Mayo Clinic in Minneapolis, describing his symptoms, asking for greater explanations, asking about treatment. But by July 4th, 1939, which was when Lou Gehrig Appreciation Day was held, nobody knew that they were dealing with a death sentence. In fact, it hadn't been fully diagnosed as amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, ALS, which, as many people know, still all these years later, nobody knows how it occurs, and there is no cure. All these decades have passed, and nothing has advanced in research on that, try though they might. But they knew that Gehrig had a form of infantile paralysis, and that's what they thought they were dealing with.
That was my understanding as well, but I didn't want to use that as evidence of it because I just didn't know the facts. But that was my understanding, that he never really knew. And when he made that great speech that, as you both point out, the newsreels everybody sees every day, he did not know that. That makes it even more interesting.
Yes, it absolutely does. And I managed to interview two people who happened to be friends of mine who were present that day in the bleachers and were able to describe for me their memories of a day in the bleachers back in the 30s and on that historic day.
Talking with Marty Appel. The name of the book is Pinstripe Empire, the New York Yankees from before the Babe to after the Boss. Great history not only of the Yankees, but as Marty mentioned, of baseball itself. Let's kind of move ahead a little bit. You'd mentioned the great Joe DiMaggio, and the Yankees have always had that history, except for maybe a brief period in the late 60s where they would always, one star would leave or two stars would leave, and they'd kind of replace them. You have Joe D coming in after the Babe, and Lou Gehrig left, and, of course, Mickey Mantle came after that. How big was Joe D when he came in? I mean, he just kind of epitomized class, didn't he?
Oh, absolutely. And what a hero he was to the Italian-American community. I mean, he was just godlike figure to them. You know, when I started with the Yankees in 1968, it had been 17 years since DiMaggio had played his last game. And I would meet people all the time who would say to me, yeah, I used to root for the Yankees, but after DiMaggio quit, I lost all my interest. And I'd hear that a lot, and frankly, I never heard that after Mickey Mantle quit, as loyal as his fans were. So DiMaggio's impact was just enormous, and he was really, really a national hero. I mean, people really followed every move of his.
Well, I was fortunate enough during a rain delay in Philadelphia at Veterans Stadium. Joe, of course, I don't know if you knew Eddie Liberatore well or not. Did you know Eddie Liberatore at all?
I had met him a few times. I know about him.
Yeah, he and Joe were sort of inseparable for a great number of years, and
yes,
they were in the press box at the Vet, and we had a rain delay. And I said to Eddie, I said, "You think Joe will come on for a few minutes?" He came on for 20-some minutes during a rain delay. And it's the only real interview I ever kept. I'm not much of a historian, but it's the only one I actually retained until this day. And he couldn't have been more amenable to anything. You know, obviously, let me qualify that by saying before he came on, I knew there were certain things you don't ask him about. And
right.
You know, we talked about baseball. We didn't talk about any of the other things in his life, his kids or his wife or any of that stuff. But he stayed 20-some minutes and talked about the 56th game hitting streak, talked about Kenny Keltner and what happened at third base that night on a rainy night in Cleveland at Cleveland Municipal Stadium, and talked about the hitting streak after that. And he was very forthright. I was, a little surprised that he was quite as conversational as he was.
He also had a great wisdom in foreseeing events, because in 1975, on Old Timers Day, when I was the Yankee PR director, that was the first time we hired Billy Martin as manager, and it was to be announced that very day. So, it being Old Timers Day, I greeted DiMaggio at the player entrance and walked with him towards the locker room where the players would change. And as we're walking, I'm just making small talk, and I said, I guess you saw in the newspaper this morning that Billy Martin's being named manager today. And Joe looked at me and said, good luck with that.
And you found that to be true on a number of occasions.
At least 5.
A number of occasions. Joe foresaw that one on the very first day.
Well, I don't think any player or any athlete ever has been able to maintain and keep an image that Joe D wanted his whole life. I mean, from Old Timers Day, like you said, he wanted to be introduced a certain way, but he always maintained that image of kind of being the greatest living ball player of all time. Even his commercials for the Mr. Coffee, I remember the Bowery Bank commercials. People in New York remember those. I mean, he kept that image his whole life.
Well, sometimes people would have issue with how he could be a little prickly, a little difficult in some circumstances. And I used to say to myself, hey, he's Joe DiMaggio, he's entitled.
Yeah. I mean, to the public image I'm talking about. Privately, you heard stories he could be a little difficult, but publicly he maintained that kind of dignity about him. You never really saw him or heard him.
He had that dignity on the ball field, too. I mean, everything he did seemed like guided by perfection. He just was the perfect ball player. He never did anything wrong.
I think one of the most amazing things about the family was that Vince was one kind of ball player, Dominic was another kind of ball player, and Joe was the third kind of ball player. And to have three, major league players, but if you looked at each one of them, you wouldn't know that that they were the same person.
That's true. That's very true. And of course, Joe's style was, everybody tried to imitate it because it was so pure, but nobody could beat Joe DiMaggio. He just, the statistic that, if people hadn't heard it before, they're always amazed, but 361 home runs, 369 strikeouts in his career.
Amazing.
Incredible.
And he lost at least 3 full seasons to the military, so he would have been probably around close to 500 home runs, maybe, and
yes,
maybe not 3,000 hits, but approaching it, right? If he didn't lose those 3 years.
Probably not the 500 home runs because he still had to deal with that distant left field in Yankee Stadium.
Right.
Very hard for a right-hander. He never hit a World Series home run in Yankee Stadium. That was one of the things I just stumbled on.
Yeah, I saw that in your book. I did not know that.
Yeah, the first catch by Algie Unfrito might have been the only one that he might have hit there.
Yeah, but that was still 10, 12 feet from the fence. I mean, he wasn't even on the warning track or when Gianfrido caught that ball.
Probably wasn't going to go.
No, he wasn't close to hitting a home run there. But I always thought that, obviously one of the records I don't think will ever be broken, the 56 straight games. But I think more importantly, the fact that he only struck out 13 times is one of the most amazing, accomplishments for the guy that hit number of home runs and MVP awards and all. Here's Ted Williams going to hit 406, and Joe only strikes out 13 times all season. You see that in a week, some of these guys today.
Yogi was another one who hardly ever struck out. I mean,
that's right.
Remarkable. If you just research those guys' records and you go, he struck out how many times? It's like phenomenal.
Well, how difficult was it to go from the great era, it's a murderer's row, and then go to the decline, and then come back up again as the boss started to put things together, and as you said, the great McCarthy era. How difficult it was to go to the down periods and make interesting stories out of those?
The stories were always there. The CBS years were the years in which I started actually working there.
Yeah.
And,
he should have stayed. He should have stayed in the circus.
Michael Burke, I guess you're talking about.
I know I'm talking Michael Burke. He may have been a Wharton graduate, but he should have stayed with Ringling Brothers.
Well, the one line that I guess you would like in the book about Mike Burke is I talk about after he passed away, I went to St. Patrick's Cathedral for his memorial service, and I found myself sitting next to the novelist Kurt Vonnegut, the great American novelist. And I said to myself, well, maybe this is all you need to know about Michael Burke. He gets Kurt Vonnegut to come to his memorial service, but he never could find a second baseman to replace Horace Clarke.
Poor Horace Clarke. He played so long for a team that just was terrible.
And he had a whole era has come to be named for him.
Incredible.
Well, then the boss, you get some great stories about Steinbrenner, and obviously, we all know he could be difficult, but he spent the money. I think that's what New York Yankee fans appreciated the most about him. He wanted to win, and he was committed to winning. You could say he may have caused them to lose as much as he won back in the 80s, but he was the right guy at the right time, don't you think, Marty?
Well, he put the money back into the franchise, which is what Jacob Ruppert did in the 20s and 30s, and that's why the Yankees remained successful. Other teams did not do that. And so to both of their credits, and to Topping and Webb as well in the 50s and early 60s, that was what continued to make the Yankees succeed year after year, to replenish the team with, top-rate ball players. And I think the fact that Babe Ruth was a Yankee influenced many generations of future players that when they had a choice before there was a draft, they wanted to play for Babe Ruth's team. They wanted to play in Babe Ruth's ballpark. It was a very, very powerful image that exists, could say to this day.
I was going to say right till today.
Sure.
What about Dan Topping and Del Webb were unbelievable owners with George as the general manager, and they were both so successful. Why did they decide that this was the time to sell the team? Why did they decide to get out of baseball when they were so successful with it?
Well, first of all, the game itself was declining. They had first thought they might like to put it on public sale as like the Green Bay Packers, make shares available to the public.
Right.
They engaged the services of Lehman Brothers to investigate that, and Lehman Brothers came back and told them, this is not a good time for this industry. We recommend that you do this now. So instead, they started to sort of plan a sale and kind of wound down their time there and stopped pouring money into big bonus players and everything. But also the players were not there. Baseball was falling into a decline. If you look back to the mid to late 60s, baseball produced Tom Seaver, Johnny Bench, and Reggie Jackson, and not many other people, you could say, came in at an elite level. The best athletes were not going to baseball, and Topping and Webb foresaw that, and brilliantly, you could say, got out after the 64 season, and the team collapsed in 65.
And of course, that was the switch year, wasn't it? When the Cardinals and Yogi, wasn't that 64?
64 was the Cardinal Yankee World Series.
Right.
After the World Series, the Yankees fired Yogi.
Right.
Hired Johnny Keane from the Cardinals. But that didn't work out well at all. Keane was not a good fit, and all the great Yankee stars were aging right under him, and it became a 12-year downfall that began in 65.
Well, Marty, we could talk baseball for hours, but you have a life you have to live, Marty, so we have to let you go. I don't want to keep you down. But we'll definitely have you on again later in the year if you're available. The name of the book is Pinstripe Empire, and give out a website, Marty. I know it's available everywhere, but do you want to give out a website? People can get a hold of the book, or you?
Well, it's at Barnes & Noble, or it's available on Amazon. And I love my independent bookstores all over the country. It's available there. It's actually been the #1 selling baseball book in America.
Yeah.
Just in the 3 weeks that it's been out. So that's very gratifying and
great.
Speaks well of the brand. People love to read about the Yankees.
And what your final comment just on the boss? What you worked closely with him, and
Yes.
What do you think?
Well, when he first arrived on the scene, we knew he was a tough boss. We didn't know that he was going to become nationally famous and portrayed on the Seinfeld show. That we were dealing with a celebrity in his own right. We just thought he was the new owner of the team, and
Right.
we didn't know the magnitude of what was to come. There were trying days. There were frustrating days. But in the end, he gave the fans a great product. He gave the media a great copy. Great competition. For those of us in the front office who might have felt his wrath, we were a very small, insignificant part of the whole story.
You must be close to LaGuardia because I hear planes going over there
That's down
somewhere.
by
I
me,
thought
Don.
that was on your end.
I'm outside.
Well, I'm on the Jersey Shore. Maybe Doug, you got planes going over
Yeah,
here.
I'm doing it from my outside studio tonight, so that's
okay.
night tonight.
Well, Marty, thank you from my side as well. It was great talking with you, and it's always nice to talk Yankee baseball, and we'll be watching them tonight when they come back on from California with a tough loss last night.
Yeah, hey, I enjoy talking to you guys a lot, so let's do it again for sure.
Absolutely. They got another giant Jeter, so we'll start all over again.
Okay.
We'll talk to you soon, Marty. Thanks for joining us.
You bet. Bye-bye now.